Welcome to our reader chat. Today we have Caitlin Schmidt, who's a reporter at the Arizona Daily Star. She has solutions journalism for us. And I'm really excited that she's on today. Now. She does really good work. And what she's doing now with solutions journalism is one of the more interesting things that's happening in the journalism world right now. So I will, ask her to, introduce herself a little bit. I'll have some questions that I'll ask her, but if you would like to ask any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll forward them along. So first of all, hello, Caitlin.
Hello.
All right. So could you just kind of tell us a little, how long have you been at the Star? What types of things have you covered? What would have been your beats?
Definitely. So I actually started at the Star as our health apprentice in 2013. And I spent 2 semesters as a student covering health for us. And then I was hired as a breaking news reporter right when I graduated at the end of 2014. So I was our JCOPS reporter. So I covered public safety, disasters, murders, mayhem, all that exciting stuff. And then a couple of years later, I moved over to our government desk and covered the city of Tucson, and I covered Pima County, focusing on specific areas. And then when things got a little bit chaotic at the University of Arizona in terms of athletes and coaches getting in trouble with the law, I moved over to the sports desk full-time to work on investigations, but also enterprise stories and features about young athletes in and around our community. And then I just moved over as our solutions reporter in August. So it feels like I've done a little bit of everything, but there's still plenty I haven't covered. But this new beat kind of lets me cover all the things I haven't. So I get to write stories about education, housing, so a little bit of everything.
Yeah, and so like solutions journalism, it's kind of a beat, but it's not like a traditional way of looking at a beat, right? Just like you said, you can bounce around different topics. You're not like confined to, I cover City Hall or I cover the school boards or whatever. So could you kind of tell us like what is solutions journalism?
So solutions journalism is rigorous reporting on the responses to social problems. And so I report on people and places and groups that are working to fix problems in our community, bridge gaps in equity, and also help break down barriers so that people have equal access to services, anything like that. So I am reporting on problem solvers. And as Kurt said, and I said, it encompasses all beats. So kind of like our investigative reporters who don't really have one single beat they bounce around, I'm doing the same thing. But solutions journalism really aims to kind of rebalance the news and present not just the problem, but also what's being done to fix it. And one of the goals of that is to kind of restore some of the trust in the public, but also to rebalance what we have done with investigative reporting, which often has kind of a negative tone and it highlights the worst in things. Solutions kind of looks for the best. So it is basically just changing the narrative on the way we report on different topics.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would like to hear you, give some examples of that. I was just looking through your story about, I think her name was Desiree, who was on the Ellen DeGeneres show for foster kids. Could you kind of, tell people, what that story was and how it fits into solutions journalism?
Definitely. And I love that story. That was one of my favorite ones that I've covered so far. So I profiled a woman named Desiree Cook, who runs a nonprofit called IMU 360 that provides services to kids in and coming out of foster care. And she got started more than a decade ago, providing these hygiene bags for kids in foster care with full-size items, shampoo, conditioner, that was tailor-made based on their age and their gender and their ethnicity. And it was a way for her to help these kids remember that they were individuals and more than a barcode and people who really mattered. And from there, she kind of spawned into a mentorship program. And this summer, she actually got some apartments from a local person who believed in her cause. And now she has 10 kids that are in safe housing with some oversight. And her new goal is to build a tiny home village so that these kids can have their own individual home, and well, they'll be paying rent. Half of their rent will also go into an equity account so that when they're ready to move out, they have a savings account that they can put a down payment on. So that story included a lot of the problems that these foster kids face while they're in foster care, coming out of foster care. But the focus was really on what Desiree has done and is doing to try to make things better for them and fix that problem.
When I was reading it, I was thinking about if this weren't like a solutions journalism type of story, it probably would have been the number of kids in foster care in Pima County rose 17% last year. And here is like, an anecdote about a foster kid, having a hard time, maybe another one doing it differently. But I can almost just see how it would play out. But with the angle of solutions journalism, as I was reading it, I was just going along with it, and I felt really good about it. And I was like, this is just a really, really good thing. And I wanted you kind of touched on this a little bit ago, but like the difference between solutions journalism and traditional journalism. I wonder if, like, you've been doing this for some months now, and I wonder if you could just talk about that. Like, is there a whole traditional news method that solutions journalism fills, or whatever you think about that?
I really think it's just rebalancing the way that we tell stories. I think you could take any of these solution stories that I've written and change the format, change what's in that lead and the top half of the story, and make it into a news story. The information's all in there. It's just a little lower in the story with the solution right up top. So I really think it's tackling the same subjects. It's just tackling them in a different way and putting a focus on that solution instead of the problem. And I've done it with other topics. One of the first ones that I did before it was even my beat, earlier this spring, I wanted to look into the rising homicide rates, because back in April, it was already pretty bad. And so I talked to Tucson Police Department, not only about the problem with all these homicides, but more so the solution and what they were trying to do to fix it, and got some real detailed information about these new programs that they were trying out. And as we've seen 6 months later, homicides are still up, so they're not necessarily working immediately or as fast as they want them to. But that's part of solutions, and we included that in the story as you talk about the limitations and the barriers that these people are facing. So back in that story in April, we had talked about one of the limitations of these new methods is that they take time, and it can take months or even, a year or years to see the effects. So that doesn't mean it's a failure per se, but that is one of the 4 pillars of solutions journalism, is that, you include the response, you include insight, you include evidence to that it's worked or why it's worked somewhere else, but you also include the limitations, so that we're not just writing a puff piece, but we're being really honest about what's happening with this solution or attempted solution.
And the idea that, there might be solutions elsewhere in a different state or town or whatever. Like, how do you approach that when you're reporting? Do you do like an internet search for this type of problem in other places, or how would you go about that?
So I look for data in those terms, and this is really where I got my start with solutions back in 2019. I got a travel fellowship through the Solutions Journalism Network to go and visit other colleges to try to figure out what they were trying to do to solve sexual misconduct issues on campus. At the time, U of A was having some serious problems with that. Their responses maybe weren't working, and I was kind of just tired of writing about it from that angle. And so I was intrigued by the idea of looking at places that had this problem and fixed it to a degree, or maybe had taken proactive steps over the years so that they didn't get into this problem in the first place. So for that one, I used data from all of the Power 5 schools in the United States about Title IX complaints, which were those sexual misconduct complaints. And that's a tricky one because, at first glance, it looks like if a place has a large number of complaints and then all of a sudden the complaints go down, what they're doing must be working, right? But the flip side of that is if you don't have a lot of complaints, you also might be fostering an environment where people don't feel comfortable complaining. So that one, I kind of approached where I was going to look at in a few different ways. I picked a school, Baylor, that was historically known for kind of being the worst of the worst. But when I spoke to attorneys that litigate Title IX, and asked them, where should I be looking? They all agreed Baylor had taken amazing measures and spent millions of dollars in the wake of all of these disasters to try to fix things. So that was a combination of data and the advice of experts on the topic. And then I just went with data for the rest. So yeah, it starts with a simple internet search, but because part of solutions journalism is that evidence-based quality, data is really helpful. And so luckily, when we're talking about public agencies like police departments or school districts, most of that information is available publicly. And you can also just ask, I also just ask the places that are working on these problems what they're doing to address them. I wrote one a few months ago about the Tucson police chief, then Chief Chris Magnus, wanting us to move into what's called a co-response program, where police are working side by side with social workers, both at the dispatch level and out on the streets, to make sure that we're properly handling the calls that they get and the response to them. And we have a little bit of co-response going on here. We have a MIS team, some specialized teams, but we don't have a true co-response model. And so for that story, I asked TPD, who have you been looking at? What programs do you think are the ones out there that would work here? And they pointed me in the direction of several other ones. So, and then I looked at the data from those to make sure that it actually was working, and ended up going with Mesa, both because of proximity and the immediacy in the results. So it's kind of a combination of everything. And that's sort of what I want to do with this beat is, make sure that the data backs up what I'm doing, but ask the community, ask the people that are involved in these problems, who's working to fix them, who should I be talking to?
Yeah. All right, well, looks like we got a question here from Kathy.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Hi.
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 Curious if is solution reporting sometimes built into investigative reporting, so that with something like the 3-day coverage of what was happening in Guaymas and Nogales, is there a follow-up on your part, or would you put that on a list to write about that at some point to see, well, what will happen?
I mean, so I have to be really careful with this, because I am treading on other reporters' beats to try to determine what kind of stories I'm going to write and what kind of follow-up there will be on their stories. So like that is a perfect example, but I haven't talked to Emily Bragle, our reporter that wrote that story, yet to see. But when I have had people reach out to me to say, hey, here's something you should write about as a solution, just as a good rule of thumb, I always like to reach out to the reporter that covers that beat, just to make sure that they know what I'm doing, that they're okay with it, and ideally to try to get them to either work on the story with me or take it on their own, because what we really want is for this to kind of become a regular thing across all aspects of the newsroom. I'm one person doing this type of reporting, and there's not enough me to cover all of the work out there. But I would love it if we can get other reporters doing it too. So we've had our U of A reporter, Catherine, wrote a story several months ago about a fellowship program at the U of A that will fast track tenured positions for professors of color. And she was happy to take on that solution story. So our reporters don't know this yet, but I received a fellowship recently through the Solutions Journalism Network that will involve training the newsroom on how to identify solution stories, how to find them, just to make sure that we are kind of doing that all over the place. So it is a type of investigative reporting. And every time I see a story in the paper that one of my colleagues has written that focuses largely on just the problem, I add it to my list, or I send a message really quick to see if they want help or if they thought about it that way. So we're trying to figure out the best way to kind of disseminate it in a mass production way and get everyone on board, but we're in the very early stages. But I agree, I think that sewage story is a perfect example.
Yeah, and I'd add also, so Alex DeVoyd and we did a big project, migrants dying in the desert. And pretty early on in the process, our editor was asking us to come up with like recommendations for what should be done. So kind of like a solutions idea. And I can tell you that it completely changed like how we approached everything. Rather than trying to just, present this heartbreaking reality, it became like, all right, this is a problem that could be solved. So what can we put out there that like a public policy response? And I think it does, like invigorate the reporting. So however well we execute it is one thing, but like the idea of it is really good.
And I find that I feel better at the end of the stories. Like, I mean, these are some pretty bleak topics. They really are. But when you work that solution into your reporting, your soul feels a little better at the end of it. Like maybe there's some light at the end of the tunnel. So, you know, it's good for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that, you know, like you mentioned, years ago, you were covering some pretty dark stuff, you know, lots of crime, lots of murders, things like that. And you still, now you're approaching, you know, the TPD response to issues, but with the solutions bent to it, it does feel a little bit lighter. It does feel like there's, and I hope we talked a minute about this before this chat started with a couple of the readers, is like, I hope that readers also have a different feel for the stories, rather than just straight traditional news reporting, which is kind of, you know, spurring outrage and things like that. I hope that in the reader, they come away with it thinking about like, oh, there are things that could be done. And, you know, and while we're talking about that, I don't know if anybody at the chat right now has read any of Caitlin's stories or has any thoughts on solutions journalism. You know, you feel free to raise your hand and we'll get to you.
There's a couple of questions in the chat, Kurt.
Great.
So Kathy Scott, did you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask?
Hello. Kurt kind of beat me to asking this question that's in the chat, but where you use your sources from, who you rely on, and how you do your data searches, because any topic that you're looking on, even foster care, has so many sides. For example, the last 3 or 4 years, I'm an administrator in a school district. We have been given the task of overseeing foster kids in addition to their foster person, whatever. And that kind of angle, what are school districts doing? How are you working? You already have 52 things to do. Now you're supposed to find them an apartment. The kind of thing that you were talking about was done from the public. But I also wanted to give you a suggestion for a solutions topic that really affects the schools, and that is school resource officers. We've had one here in Nogales. It's a very competitive grant. We've had one now for 12 years, but they want to turn them into mental health providers, and they're cops. I mean, they're men in uniform carrying guns, but that's not their role as an SRO. Their role is to have law-related education. But just a suggestion, and then as a source, go to the source, go to the schools that have them, because they want to pull them out of schools. Thank you.
Thank you. That has been a controversial topic in the news. School resource officers, what to do with them, what their jobs are. So I really appreciate that tip. That's a great one. Thank you.
So I actually, along these lines, Caitlin, when you're doing this, are you reaching out to, you kind of mentioned this a little bit, do you reach out to like the public, just broadly put, to like, or you're just calling people, anybody who's involved with whatever it is you're talking about?
Yeah, you know, on some stories I'll put out a broad call, like on social media, if I'm looking for sources or somebody that has been a victim of this type of thing. I'll always ask the people involved who I should talk to. Sometimes I'll find out in research online, other good sources. As part of this fellowship that I just got, we are getting ready to really kind of tweak this beat into one that's guided by the community. That was a big part of my pitch. And so I am, as soon as we get through the holidays, I will be working with some experts, engagements experts, to draft up a survey that we're going to send out to community members and start inviting people to listening sessions, so that I can really make sure that I'm covering not only the problems that readers want me to find solutions for, but also the people that are out there in the community working hard to solve these problems. I have found very quickly, through the limited number of stories that I've been able to do in such a short time, that these people are like living, breathing Rolodexes for other ideas and other sources. I mean, people who are working for nonprofits, who are starting their own nonprofits, who are boots on the ground doing grassroots work to solve these problems, know everybody else who's doing the same kind of work. So I think my biggest problem right now is that I have a pretty big story backlog of things I want to write about, but that is a fantastic problem to have. So, and it's just going to get bigger. I know, as soon as I start inviting people to come and talk to me and tell me what they want to read and who I should talk to, that list is going to expand greatly, and I just can't wait.
That's great. So, Sarah, do we have other questions from the readers?
Yes, I did have to take a phone call, so I don't know if this was discussed, but Donald iGems was asking, how do you and your editors decide on which problems to tackle? That's kind of been touched on, but maybe a little more specific on that.
Yeah, so when I started the beat, I had a list of stories that I wanted to do already, and most of them were kind of public safety focused because that was a lot of the reporting that I was doing on the side to fill in the gaps. And my editors were really clear that this cannot just be a cops and crime solutions beat. We have to do other things. So when we launched the beat, I launched it with a column inviting readers to tell me what they wanted me to write about. And I've written a couple stories off that list, and I still have a few more to go. But once you start thinking of stories from this frame of mind, it's funny how like the press releases and story pitches that come into my email just kind of jump out when they're appropriate. So, you know, it's a combination of trying to break up some of the public safety stories with other ones. Sometimes we'll do a solution story based on what's topical at the time. Right back when the pandemic unemployment insurance was coming to an end, I did a story about unemployment insurance, and actually it was a little less solutions that I would have liked because the story focused largely on how fraud was a huge problem for people seeking this, but you know, solutions are in the works. So that one was kind of driven by what was happening at the time. I did a solution stories on childcare because we had a project going on, but really it's a matter of just kind of trying to break them up so that we're not writing about the same things several weeks in a row. So like I have another housing story that I would like to do, but I just did one on housing. So I think we'll do a public safety one. And so it's just kind of breaking them up. But certainly if there is topical news, like a program's coming to an end, something's coming to town. We have a film screening in January for a movie that just won some awards at the Sunscreen Film Fest about sex trafficking. And there's going to be a Q&A panel with some local experts afterwards. And so I'm getting a story ready for the weekend before just because of the timeliness. But, you know, it's kind of just a mix of what's going on out there in the world and what I've covered recently and what's still left on the list. So.
Let's see, the same, Donald also had a comment saying, reducing central administration requirements on principals and teachers may be a partial solution to the teacher burnout. Does this fit into solutions journalism?
It definitely does. One of the stories that I wrote a couple of weeks ago about school counselors focused not just on this influx of funding that came from pandemic emergency funds, but also how the change in requirements and certifications allowed districts in rural areas like Nogales and Vail to fill positions that had previously been vacant because it's harder for those people to pursue master's degrees when there aren't universities nearby. And it's also harder for the rural areas to attract candidates sometimes with higher credentials. If you're paying off a boatload of student loans, you're probably going to be looking for a higher paying job, and those rural areas just typically aren't in that boat. So yes, changing in requirements to help solve a problem definitely fits into solutions, and I have written that down. So thank you, Donald.
You're going to walk away with a page of notes today.
I love it. That's great.
Stephanie Keenan asked, are you familiar with Yes Magazine? It's a solutions magazine.
I have heard of it, but it was mentioned in a solutions webinar that I was in a few weeks ago, but I haven't had a chance to explore it in depth yet. But there is a lot of work going on out there to form specific solutions publications or collaboratives. I wasn't aware of how big this is internationally. The fellowship that I was just accepted into has 15 other fellows. I think only 3 of us are from the United States. So there's a lot of work being done in South America, in Africa, in India, and in Asia to kind of bring solutions to the masses. And some of those projects are amazingly ambitious. One of the ones from last year actually established a Costa Rican like solutions journalism network of its own. And there's like 35 journalists participating in solutions journalism across the country, both as freelancers and in different outlets. So I'm not surprised, but yes, I've heard of it, but I need to check it out.
And let's see, I'm not sure if this falls directly under you, but how are social workers working with police? If you're involved with this, Tucson now is is 12. It now is in the top 12 for homicides. So just wondering how social workers and police working together, I guess.
I mean, it's in a really limited capacity right now, and they've been very transparent about that. We have some vacant positions for social workers to work with the department that we haven't been given the green light to hire those positions yet from the city. But right now, we have social workers working with the mental health support team. They are primarily dealing with people that are known to be suicidal, but also trying to do follow-up with people who have experienced mental health crises, who have had contact with police in the past. We also have social workers working on the homeless outreach team and on the substance use resource team. They have peer navigators with Kodak and other agencies that are riding along with police to talk to these people and get them connected with services right away if possible. I did a ride along back in October with the substance use resource team, and it's interesting going out on a ride with police where they're very clear that they have no intention on arresting anyone unless they see an immediate dangerous violent crime occur. But we took 2 people to Kodak to sign them up for services and get them helped out with housing, and they ride in the car with the social workers. So, I mean, it's an extremely limited capacity. It's focusing on these small groups. Ideally, one of the things that Chief Magnus really was wanting to do before he left was get social workers, basically the crisis line, embedded in the 911 center so that they can work with 911 dispatchers, because people don't always call the right line. People call 911 when they need help for a crisis all the time instead of that crisis response line. But if you have those people there in the building that they can physically transfer the call over to, that you don't have to do a call transfer that maybe takes 20 minutes to get picked up or that drops, that will help fill the need. So I know that it's something that they want to do in a larger scale. I actually have an interview with our new police chief, Kazmar, tomorrow, and I will be asking him if he wants to continue those efforts to bring in more social workers. I think it's a department-wide thing, but we also know that the city wants this because they've been talking about this community safety pilot program for quite a while that will involve the use of social workers in a police response. So long answer to a short question, but yes, very limited. I mean, I think we are in single digits, 8 or 10 maybe, that are working with the department, but it really is just in these specialized divisions for right now.
Becky asks, do you ever use U of A or Pima County Extension Service staff for ideas or as resources? What you're doing sounds like what their jobs are, getting research-based solutions out to the public.
And I've been trying to work more with the U of A and Pima directly, but you're right, Pima has a ton of programs like this. We wrote about some of them with our childcare project. They're specifically having a program to provide degrees and childcare to single moms, but not just regular degrees in fields that are high paying jobs with quick room for advancement. So not yet. I'm not working with them directly, but I agree. They are absolutely doing the same thing, but in a different format than I am. So they are already on my list of some of the folks that I should be inviting to these listening sessions and picking their brain for ideas and thinking about like a loose partnership for certain.
So Richard has a question, and this was kind of along the lines of something I had as a question for you. Richard asks, how much pushback do you get from one particular solution? It seems like your articles could be perceived as just an extended editorial with what some may say is biased data.
Like how much pushback am I getting from? So what I found is that when I have been doing the large multi-source stories with like 8 or 10 people, the reality of our smaller print product is that they get cut a lot. And so my advice from editors was to cut those stories down and focus on a single solution per story so that the whole story will make it in the paper. And so that's why we've been doing it that way. but those stories also address the limitations that these people are dealing with this single solution and the caveats. Most of those limitations are funding, but we're very clear what solutions journalism does, and I'm trying to keep my writing as unbiased as possible. But the fact is that my job now is to write about people working to solve problems. So that might sound like editorializing. But I wonder if you think that a deep investigative story that only focuses on problems is also editorializing, because along that same vein, it's kind of doing the same thing. So, I think that's kind of the hard part of finding the balance. Is I can't write a solution story without spending a decent amount of space and time talking about the problem. And that, I think, is kind of what keeps it balanced out. I'm very clear in these stories that like this isn't the only solution, and the solution certainly isn't going to solve this problem. My sources are very clear about that. Desiree Cook didn't make any claims that her tiny village for 9 people is going to solve the foster care problem. But when we're writing about, a single person working for a greater cause, I'm trying to keep it as unbalanced as possible. But certainly, like when I started this beat, I came in wanting to write, here's a problem, and here are all the different solutions that are happening in the community, and here's what's wrong with all of them. But I wasn't able to make that work with editors, and was told to cut them down this way. So, but I would like to take this back to them and let them know that this was brought up, because that was kind of my concern about breaking them down. But, it's kind of the unfortunate realities of journalism. Our deadlines are an issue, but also so is that space. And we want to get the whole story out there. I had one story that was cut 35%, and the initial cut that came was the data that supported why this solution worked. And when we have to make cuts like that to fit it in the paper, I have to figure out how to scale things down. So it's a work in progress, but I do think this is a valuable critique to take back to editors and let them know that things can be perceived this way when we're reporting on solutions in such a microscopic level instead of the big picture.
And part of that question was about the data gathering and bias. At that level of the reporting of gathering and analyzing data, do you find that you're approaching it differently as a solutions journalist than a traditional journalist?
I mean, no, not really. I'm still, if I get government data, I'm still going to try to find it from another source to make sure it's accurate data, and vice versa. I didn't forget all the stuff that I learned when I was going after the police and the U of A for misconduct and that sort of thing. I mean, you always want to try to verify your data from more than one source. But some of these stories also that I've reported on are very small solutions, or solutions that are very early in the process, and there isn't necessarily data, but we have some like qualitative results, or we have some anecdotal evidence that it's working, and that sometimes is what you just need to do. I did a story a while ago about an app that TUSD released for kids, students and parents, that provides them with counseling services, either virtual counseling, or it can connect them to an in-person counselor if they need that. And I had no data for that story, because this was an app that they designed on their own. They took some things that they liked from various programs, but they made their own. So there wasn't data that I could get from like a parent app. And they had just released it, and so there wasn't any data about who had downloaded it or who had used it at that point in time. And so I just needed to be very clear in the story, and my source did it for me, was that this thing just came out and we don't have data. So, we try to get it when it's there, but if it's not there, then the next best thing I'll ask for is that anecdotal evidence of, why do you think this is working? Give me some examples of how you see this making a difference.
Okay.
And I think that question, from the gentleman before, I think when people say editorial or opinion, it's kind of a gray line sometimes. Even we've had this discussion before in this chat about like what Tim Steller does, what the opinion pages do, what the reporters do. And now with solutions journalism, it brings another level of that. So I think that's where the explanation of understanding that it's not your opinion of like, this is the best solution, or this is going to fit. You're talking to experts, you're talking to, and in that research, this is the solution that's suggested as being a possible solution, correct?
Yes. And for most of these problems, there isn't just one solution, right? I mean, we don't live in a black and white world. We live in a world full of gray areas, and there are endless solutions. I mean, look at the ones I wrote about in April that we're doing for homicide don't look like they're working, but we are still giving them a shot. And certainly there are more, but there really just isn't a one size fits all approach when we're talking about fixing problems.
Did Brian Gross, I think you had your hand up, if you wanted to unmute yourself.
Yes, I was just wondering about where you have to cut down a piece that winds up having lots of aspects to it and lots of data to it. If it would be a good approach to have on the website for the paper the more expansive data and more of the story, and then just have that one focus that actually makes it into print, which has the more limited space requirement.
Yeah, and we've had some discussions about that over the years. Anyone that's read our environmental reporter, Tony Davis, he writes as long as I do and sometimes longer, and he is always asking if we can get the full versions of his story online. So I really don't know why we haven't been able to do that yet, but I agree with you. If we're going to have to cut things like that, then we should make that full version available online. I think it has mostly to do with our design center and content management system. But after that one big cut, that's when I kind of changed my approach to try to work things out. Another way that we can do that is like series of stories. That's what I had intended to do when I did the 3 stories that focused on what schools were doing to address students' mental health and wellness, but just interviews, some took longer than another and got rescheduled, and I didn't want to sit on them, and we weren't able to get them all out back to back. But for some of these bigger topics that I know I'm not going to get it all into one story, I would like to do a series of stories like Kurt and Alec did with the migrant story, or like we saw with the Emily Bregel stories about the sewage issue as well. So.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. But I will let my editors know that we have readers out there that would like to read expanded online versions.
Yes, please do. Give them my name if you have to.
Okay.
Well, and I think too, we run into the issue, sad to say, but staffing wise, that, even if we can't fit a story in print, even if it goes completely online digitally, that entire story still needs to be copy edited and all of that. And that still takes a staff. And I hate to even say that, but unfortunately that can become an issue at times where, okay, we have enough staff to, copy edit this, not this, and that's just a sad fact.
Yeah, and we see it happen all the time. I mean, if somebody's out sick from the copy desk, stories will get held because there's no one to read them. So it's, we're trying our best with our skeleton crew here. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't help the copy desk when I write full page newspaper articles either. So I'm trying.
I'm wondering if it would be applicable then to have the expanded content on the web be in a separate area outside of the official paper, be like a side area, and that you have the warning up ahead to say this stuff hasn't been copy edited or whatever. This is just the raw data or whatever kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah, that one is unlikely. For if the Star puts its name on it, we have to have it be fact checked and all that. Even with letters to the editor and all that stuff, it's obvious that it's one person's opinion, but we do our best to make sure that it's as factual as possible, just because it's going under our name. So it's complicated.
Trust me, we have that daily debate, or maybe not daily, monthly, even with letters to the editor. Can't we just print it? Like this letter, even if it's totally, I don't want to use the word crazy, but just totally unfounded, or because it's still reflecting what someone thinks, so in some ways we're like, let's put it in there so people realize, but yep, we just can't go there. I think Kent had his hand up. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, I would think that many of the problems that groups are having has to do with laws and funding. And that tends to relate to state government, and state government relates to politics. And so I was wondering to what extent you explore those factors that I've just mentioned.
Yes, definitely the stories that I have written about that involve funding, whether it be grant funding or emergency relief funding. Most of my sources will give a little nod to the legislature or to readers and mention that this, we really need the government to step up. One of them recently was when we wrote about childcare. We have some great local programs that are going on through emergency funds, but once those emergency funds run out, where are we going to get the money? And that kind of is a trend that I found in a lot of these programs that I've written about through Solutions is most of them now are either pandemic relief funds or ARP funds, or they're grant funded, which means they have an expiration date. And what happens when that runs out, right? Like Tucson is no longer behind. We don't have a backlog of sexual assault kits that are untested anymore, but that's because we had grant funding to test them. So we need to find a way to work that into the budget. So luckily my sources do a lot of that work for me with pointing directly to the political factor here and urging people to take action. When I'm talking to politicians or elected officials, they're pretty good at that one, at shifting the due diligence to others. But definitely, like when we talk about these school counselors, this is a 2-year grant that they're on under. What happens when that grant funding runs out? Are we really just going to pull these counselors out of the schools and leave the schools to deal with, K through 8th grade students that have no counselors, no social workers anymore because it was a temporary situation? So we're kind of dealing with that reality right now over in the Tucson Police Department. Their grant funding for their sex trafficking efforts ran out and they did not reapply. So I'm getting ready to write about this. We're down to one detective that covers sex trafficking, and she actually is embedded in another unit, threat mitigation, and just kind of brought sex trafficking in with her. But we don't have like a whole team of detectives anymore just because we don't have that grant funding. And it's fairly recent, and so it's tough to say what the implications are now, but long term we'll, I'm sure, see how that works. Instead of having several detectives working on this, luckily this one detective is now co-embedded with HSI, so we have the assistance of Homeland Security when we need it. But what the lack of grant funding for this has meant was that they can't be proactive anymore. They can just be reactive. They don't have the money anymore for the staffing to go out and do operations to try to bust up sex trafficking. Really, all they can do now is respond to it and investigate claims when they get it. So, yes. So yeah, I'm true. When they have financial implications that involve our electeds, I definitely try to get that in the story so people are aware, because it all comes down to voting at some point in time or another.
Yes. Well, are there groups that address specifically the issue of funding?
It's tough. It's tough to say. There are certainly groups that, like nonprofits, that will provide funding for those areas, but like if there are oversight groups, I don't really know.
Kathy Scott had another kind of suggestion, kind of touched on this a little bit. She says, I have a nephew who is with TPD as a fire investigator. That department used to have several officers, but now he is it. Solutions to how law enforcement can handle investigations given their low staffing and the inability to attract trained staff, even if funding is there for added personnel.
Yeah, that is a good one too. And I just talked to Chief Magnus about that in the story that I did about his hopes for the department. And he said on his way out of town, his biggest concern is staffing and the lack of staffing and the difficulty that we're having, not just retaining officers, but also recruiting officers. And so in that particular article, he really nodded heavily at the mayor and council for the need to step up these salaries. But, I think it would be, now that I know that there's a second unit that only has one detective investigating something, I would be curious to know how many units Tucson Police Department has that are really just one person trying to do the whole thing themselves. Up until recently, So now we have 2 bilingual detectives, one for adult sexual assault, the other for domestic violence issues. But before that, we didn't have anyone specifically investigating those things. And these people are here because of grant funding. So thank you, Kathy. Might not end up being a solution story, but if we have a department that has several units that are really just one person, that certainly is something the public needs to know.
Yeah, I think a unit doesn't suggest one.
Right.
So
Yeah,
they need to be renamed individual.
Yeah, I mean, and I know that the fire departments handle investigations on their own, but they always need that police assist, and having one person handling all of the fire investigations for the city of Tucson doesn't really seem like a tenable situation.
So Donald says maybe Click Council will support more paragraphs from you in the future. And yeah, like we always appreciate you guys clicking on our articles, reading our articles, sharing our articles. It helps because it does help a decision in the future for a future article, or for possibly allowing more space, because we were able to track the metrics on that article that it had interest, because that's feedback from our readers and we're listening to that feedback. So definitely clicks can help.
Yeah, and time on page too. I really pushed the boundaries with that Chief Magnus exit article that was almost 100 inches. I've been told not ever to do that. And the analytics on that are great. So this is really going to help me the next time I try to sell a book as a news article.
Let's see. So Richard has a really great point kind of question. He said, I certainly support what you are doing. From my personal perspective, I actually would like to get some idea of how I personally might help affect a solution. It's so sad to see documentaries, newspaper articles, etc., and feel that all they do is just make me feel bad. Some solutions imply action. Do you have a solution on how individuals can do more than just feel sad, guilty, angry, fill in the blank?
So, and that's a great one. So with these stories, I'm always trying to put call to action boxes. So if I'm writing about domestic violence, we're going to have an info box with resources for people who might be experiencing domestic violence so they can find help. But we also have a little call to action box in there about if you want to get involved. So, and, sometimes that's donating, but sometimes that's volunteering. And so I would say once you find something that like you feel passionately about, find a way to get involved. These nonprofits always need help. Always need help. One of the solutions that I cannot write about is anything that involves the animal care center in Pima County, because I volunteer over there now. And they are going through crisis right now that I can't write a word about because of the conflict of interest. But that was something that when I was reporting on them years ago, just felt like me writing about them wasn't doing enough anymore. And so I went and volunteered, and now I spend my free time there. So, I think once you find something that really resonates with you, Richard, look for that little info box on how to get involved, or find an organization to get involved. And that's one of the questions that I always ask my subjects too, is if someone is reading this story and they feel like they want to help, what do they do to help? And sometimes that's really clear cut, and sometimes not as clear cut, but I always try to provide that with those stories about if this has piqued your interest and you want to do something, here's what you can do. So I say go with your gut and find something near and dear to you and see what they need help with. Everybody needs help right now. Everybody's struggling.
That's an understatement.
Well, I have a question. You're focusing on problems and solutions, and you've been doing this for some months, and you've tackled a number of different issues. How do you think about in the future going back and revisiting these situations to see how they're doing? Is that part of your thinking when you take on the story?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, definitely. And I've been trying. I'm trying to update that homicide story because I know people want to know what we're doing now. If we're trying anything different. So yes, follow-up is certainly part of it. I'm working with editors to kind of try to figure out what the appropriate time frame on that is. One of the stories that I wrote about, I've done a couple stories now about what we're doing to deal with substance use issues in Pima County. And one of them that I wrote about was a program that TPD did called a drug market intervention, where they identified non-violent people that were selling drugs in the 85705 zip code, and then brought them down to the police station and basically showed them the case they'd built against them and said, here's all the evidence. Here is the documents that we're going to file with the courts if we find you selling drugs again, or you can just stop. And so that's when I really want to follow up on and see how that works. Once it published 2 months after that, the drug market intervention, the call-in went down, and they had not identified any of those people as selling drugs anymore. But certainly I want to follow up with that and see, once we hit the 6-month mark, what are we doing? Has anyone been arrested? And, once we hit a year, if we hit a year and all 6 people that signed that contract saying they'd stop are selling drugs again, I mean, that's a story I need to tell. That's part of the solutions story. It's the same thing as if we write just a regular news story on a topic and we get more information. You got to tell the rest of that story. So, maybe not all of them are stories that I'll follow up on, but when we have something like that, where these people have been offered a choice, I think our readers will really want to know a year from now what those 6 people are doing. So, in my chaotic tracking document, there are certain stories that I have flagged to follow up on.
Spreadsheets. Yep.
Love them.
So do we have any other questions from the readers?
Hold on. Yeah, I think that is it for right now as far as questions, unless something else comes in. So I think that kind of wraps us up.
Great. So Caitlin, thank you so much. I'm very excited for you, and I'm very excited, like, as a profession, to have more solutions journalism spread so that everywhere across the country, across the world, the journalism shifts from the kind of outrage machine to putting forth ideas and kind of empowering readers. I think this is fantastic. Do you have anything you would like to add before we wrap this up?
I would just say, like, you all gave me some great ideas. I'm now going to add them to my list. And if you have any other ideas of issues or people or groups out there that are working, please send me an email. Let me know. I really, really do want this. I really want this beat to be informed by the community. And I want to make sure that I'm covering the topics that the people that are reading the Star want to know about. So if you have an idea, please send it my way. I also want to add that I get the nicest emails now that I have moved on to this new beat. When I was a cops reporter, I used to get really horrible emails. And when I report on bad things about the U of A, my emails are not so nice, but it is nice for me now to check my email on Sunday morning when a big story has come out in the paper and get thank yous from readers. So it's changed things. So I think it could be a real game changer for journalists who start to get burnt out too. Oh, are you feeling disillusioned by journalism? Try this. It might lighten your soul. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So, but thank you all for reading and for being interested, and send me your ideas. I want them.
Okay, well then we will wrap this up, and we are entering the Christmas season. So our next reader chat is going to be on January 6th. So we're going to just go on a little bit of a hiatus. It'll be a little difficult for the next 2 weeks, but January 6th, and I will be there to talk to you about the opinion pages, any questions you might have, any suggestions, complaints, and all that. And so I think we are ready to say adieu until the 6th.